Hi guys, I thought I would talk about the latest legal battle of Robin Tilbrooke. He is challenging the lockdown in the courts. He's seeking judicial review on the lockdown legislation that was passed in March. Now, I know a lot of you guys are interested in Robin Tilbrooke because I know he was instrumental in pushing things through the courts during Brexit, and a lot of you guys asked me about him. So anyway, he's born on the 8th of April. He's an Aries, so we should just get that out of the way. So he's seeking judicial review. Judicial review can't actually challenge so much the terms of the legislation or the stipulations of the legislation, but it can challenge if it was made with proper consultation and proper scientific advice. It can challenge the way the decision-making process was made. Now, a lot of you guys will know that Gemma O'Doherty and John Waters tried the same thing in the Irish courts. They took on went as lay people and challenged the coronavirus legislation. Their they were not granted leave to seek judicial review, but they are appealing, so they're pushing it far there, and I think it's absolutely essential. We no longer have media that holds the government to account in any which way. I mean, if the media was holding the government to account, was analysing the statistics, was number crunching, then this thing would long ago be over. But right now we have a government making laws absolutely on the hoof, totally contradictory. It's become so farcical, no one knows what they're supposed to be doing under this. Large sectors of the community are not complying. At one stage, people can't have weddings, but we can have protests. I mean, the whole thing's farcical. So a couple of points that Robin Tilbrooke raised in his discussion with Sonia Poulton and Sean Atwood was that 25,000 of the UK deaths are due to the release of elderly people who were in hospital into the care homes. They absolutely forced the care homes, with recourse to the police, to take older people who were not tested for coronavirus into care homes. Now, aside from the coronavirus, a lot of those people obviously needed care that was provided by a hospital, and the care homes couldn't provide because they were now stretched to capacity. They were unprepared, and so it seems obvious to me that these deaths were hurried along, or these deaths were actually caused by that particular policy, and that needs to be scrutinized as well. He also talked that while we were in lockdown, 18 million people came into UK airports while we were on lockdown from March 23, which shows to me the farcical nature, the contradictory nature, and the fact that things are just not stacking up here. People could breeze into our airports from some of the most heavily so-called infected countries, were not checked, were not quarantined, yet the population was locked down. So that seems to me a massive contradiction. As he says, there were no closing of borders when the pandemic was at its peak, so we have to ask you about that. The government actually did nothing to stop the spread when they could have. We now reach a point where there are no elections. Do you realise that if your MP passes away, gets arrested, gets convicted of a crime, you now cannot have a by-election to choose another MP? We're not having local elections, so basically our political process has been halted. There's talk now of not having jury trials. So a fundamental concept, the jury, in our political and legal system, in our common law system, could actually be put on hold, who knows, indefinitely because of coronavirus. Do you see that our whole legal system is being changed just because of coronavirus? We're having more and more testimonies via camera, where the defendant is not even in court, where in some cases the judge wasn't caught. In the motion that Gemma O'Doherty, in their petition for leave to seek a judicial review, the judge delivered the verdict from his home. I'm sorry, I don't think this is following judicial norms. It's rather worrying. The economy is absolutely in freefall. They will try and pretend to you that there's a V shape. How can there possibly be a V shape when it's impossible for certain industries to return to normal? We've seen now the introduction of masks has discouraged people from going to supermarkets, shopping centres, etc. The ridiculous procedures in restaurants are making it there's no ambience, there's no enjoyment in going to a restaurant. Now they're having to make restaurants give half-price meals to encourage people back to restaurants, but who's paying for that? Who's bearing the cost of that? And obviously the travel industry totally decimated. what with all the theatre not happening, London's appeal as a tourist destination has gone down. I mean, why would someone sitting in, well, Australians aren't allowed to leave the country. South Africans and Chileans aren't allowed to leave the country, so they have no possibility to travel. Americans are not allowed to go to Europe. Therefore, all the French, Italian places that rely on American trade are absolutely suffering. So they're continuing to kill this economy. So I think we're going to have a look here a little bit at Robin Tilbrooke's challenge. Do you know that one of the things Robin Tilbrooke says is this is the most egregious grab of rights since the 1934 Enabling Act by Hitler and the Nazis? He said the only thing in the coronavirus legislation that the 1934 or 1933 Nazi Enabling Act had was that we're not yet able to be marched off on a train to a prison camp. Not yet. Not yet. But they can virtually do everything else. Remember I said to you before that even the Health Act of 1984 was actually a road to fascist tyranny. Under that act you can remove every one of a person's private rights. You can seize private property, you can enter people's private homes, people can be quarantined or taken off to camps, supposedly quarantine camps. These laws need looking at, because people would say, oh, we have a nice friendly government, they're not going to abuse these laws. How do you know? How do you know? I always say that World War II, and also importantly 1917, because we always concentrate on, oh, it's World War II, World War II. Loads of bad things have been happening in the world other than World War II, in lots of different countries, and even much more recently than World War II. So we just can't put our trust in that, oh, we live in a democracy and have a nice government. Well, we don't now because we can't have elections. So we don't even live in a democracy. There's no way even for people to voice their concern. So let me talk to you about it. So on the 26th of May, judicial review proceedings were launched in the High Court, and they challenged the lawfulness of the lockdown regulations as having been made ultra-virus under the 1984 Public Health Act, but also claimed they're totally disproportionate to the threat posed by COVID-19. So Philip Havers QC is acting for the claimant, who is Robin Tilbrooke, who is the solicitor bringing about this. So one of the things they say is young people and children are scarcely affected at all. And the latest available figures by the NHS, they note that out of a population of 56 million people in England, that's not the UK, COVID-19 has been cited on the death certificates of just 279 people who died in hospital in England under the age of 60 with no pre-existing health condition. So now only 279 people have actually died of COVID. Everyone else was over 60 and had a pre-existing. And yet we've shut down our economy for that, like in Melbourne at the moment. We've got 7 people over 80 have died and the whole of Victoria is shut down. I mean, every death is, of course, tragic, but death is a part of life. We can't govern our economy and live our lives to prevent all death, because death is not preventable, as we know from car accidents. A friend of mine said, well, COVID, if you get it, it can really damage you permanently. So it's not just the people who die, it's the people who are damaged. But doesn't all pneumonia damage your lungs permanently? And many people are permanently injured in car accidents, yet we still get in cars. People still fly light aircrafts. Humans take risks. Humans do mountain climbing. Humans do all sorts of crazy things. They drink alcohol, take drugs, smoke weed. All these things damage our health irreparably. Drinking while you're pregnant, fetal alcohol syndrome. All of these things damage ourselves, yet we don't shut down the economy for them. So anyway, he also points out that more than half of these regulations explain who's exempted from complying as opposed to those who have to apply. And many of the exemptions, I think this is for the travel quarantine, apply to lorry drivers, fruit pickers, airline crews, and seamen. So they don't have to apply to this quarantine when you re-enter the country. And there are no stipulations about how they proceed to their homes. So in fact, any of these people, lorry drivers, fruit pickers, etc., they're not tested. If they are infectious, they can travel in public transport when they're in confined places with hundreds of people for hours on end. They can use elevators, go to shops. Obviously, we mentioned public transport. They can touch surfaces, cough, breathe, do all the things that are known to spread the virus. And what happens when these exempted travellers arrive at their homes? Are they self-isolating for 14 days? How on earth will this be enforced? So he goes on to say that there's a source in The Guardian that said the chances of being caught actually not obeying quarantine, you'd have to be unlucky and very stupid. So these laws are basically unenforceable, and certain people who who don't agree with it, well, I'd say people have a right not to agree with it as well. Obviously, he's arguing on the basis of the narrative, but we could look at it and say, well, people have a right not to have their life disrupted for something that is only harming people with pre-existing, right? Okay. So he also says the imposition of the 14-day self-isolation requirement on UK citizens returning from abroad or non-citizens travelling to the UK will have a devastating effect on the aviation and travel industries, which are already in meltdown because of the regulations since March. I mean, TUI have slashed, I think, 106 branches, 136. Hayes Travel, who recently took over a lot of Thomson's old branches, they slashing. We continue to see job losses. Even Pizza Hut, you'd think they were a stalwart. They're going for the CVA, Pizza Express. Sorry for you guys, though, Americans, mentioning these names, because it might not apply to you in the UK, in the US, but I'm sure you know what I mean. So it says the effect is now, apart from the very wealthy or people who don't have to work, no one can book a holiday. So you've limited holidays to wealthy socialites or people who are basically retired and can self-isolate for 2 weeks when they come back. Can you see this is what the green agenda is about? It's about limiting the possibilities for ordinary people to travel, have access to the world, have access to just basic things, right? So he talks about that we can rejoice about our quiet skies and we can imagine a more responsible future where meetings are held online rather than by unnecessary flights. I mean, to be honest, I think too many meetings, conventions and seminars could be conducted by Skype or Zoom. I don't think all this business travel is essentially necessary, and it probably pushes up the price of everything we buy, because we're subsidizing all these people who want a job because there's travel involved. I do think there's far too much unnecessary travel going on in certain instances under a business pretext, right? But he said there's a heavy price to be paid for the huge fall in foreign tourists and business people who would normally fill hotels, restaurants, and tourist attractions. I mean, this is so obvious, isn't it? He talks about the so-called scientific advice, in inverted commas, and says we cannot see any reference to such scientific advice in any of the most recent minutes of SAGE that have been published so far following our client's judicial review proceedings. This is in spite of the fact that the proposal to impose a quarantine law was first mooted as far back as 9th of May. SAGE does not once mention in any of their May minutes so far published the need for a new quarantine procedure for incoming international arrivals. So where are they drawing this from? It's making law on the hoof. It's pulling it out of thin air. It's partially trying to save face. It's partially trying to win favour in the media, because all government really do is make policy according to what certain well-publicised pundits are saying. So, I mean, we get these people who endlessly pontificate from The Guardian. They represent a minority newspaper pumped up by hedge funds with dubious interests. And we have to make up policy to keep them happy. Is this how it works? One more note from their letter. It says, why, when the government tells us it has massively ramped up its testing capacity, has no attempt been made to use the testing on incoming travellers for COVID as an alternative or mitigating element to its travel restrictions? They're telling us they're now going to have a test which can give you a result in 90 minutes. Quite frankly, I don't trust these tests because they haven't isolated the virus. Basically, these tests are looking... It's the same as you standing there and someone measures your shadow and tries to understand the direction of the sun, the time of day, and then estimate your height from measuring your shadow. That's what those tests are about, to explain it in a layman's terms. The tests are not as direct as, say, you standing against a wall, using a ruler, making a mark on the wall and measuring your height. No, it's far more indirect. It's using a whole lot of variables that you have to put together and then guess your height. So these tests aren't even accurate. But if they're telling us they have this great test, why aren't they using it on people who come in if it's 90 minutes? Then you wouldn't have to use the quarantine. Then it says it may not be practicable for there to be testing of all incoming travellers at the point of entry, but there's not even an attempt to offer testing to those who ask for it as an alternative to self-isolation. If, as is the case under the travel restrictions, people who might have COVID are allowed into the country, then why can't they get a test which, if negative, could enable them to be released from the quarantine or do away with it altogether? So unless and until the government can convincingly answer these questions and address the other factors we have mentioned, there would appear to be very strong grounds for a legal challenge to the travel restrictions on the grounds of irrationality. So he goes on. I think it's really good that we're having these laws challenged, because the coronavirus legislation is a highway to tyranny. If this does not get struck off the books, it should at least have a sunset clause for the end of this pandemic and should be struck off the books. It allows the government to take far too many liberties. And I do want to consult another page, if you'll just bear with me, because there was something quite important which I forgot to add onto the main page, but I'm going to add it for you now. It says here, there's another important judicial review going on right now. Lee J. Perez, a fellow of the Lunar Society in England, is taking the Prime Minister and the SOS for Healthcare to court over changes to the Mental Health Act, which could allow one person to detain any person with a mental health condition. Tahir Ali, MP for Birmingham, is supporting this case. I would also mention to you that the government is quickly rushing through laws while this coronavirus legislation is in place. Now, none of the normal parliamentary procedures happening where Parliament arrive and they vote on legislation because they can't gather because of social distancing. So the government is in effect amending laws. After the COVID restrictions came in, they very quietly amended the abortion law, and then they very quietly amended a law on disability. It's something about the way councils assess who's disabled, and knowing I don't want to be anti-Tory because that's not necessarily my nature, but I have a friend who's disabled and he constantly goes on about how the Tories have waged war against the disabled and are effectively trying to euthanize them. Now, I'm sure that's a slight exaggeration, but I do believe the Tories rushed through a law that was just passed because there's no parliament. It could be rushed through just on government assent, or I'm not sure if those are the exact words, but it disadvantages disabled people on receiving their benefits or being declared disabled. So we need to watch out what's going on here. They're sneaking all sorts of stuff through because of this COVID legislation. I hope Robin Tilbrooke is going to get some joy on this, and just wanted to alert you guys. Like I say, I know a lot of you are fans of Robin Tilbrooke. He is part of the UK, he's part of a political party, UK Nationalist Party, no, I don't know, can't remember the exact name of his party, but come on guys, this legislation needs to be struck off. Our media won't do the job. It's up to citizen journalists and canny and brave people like Robin to take this law apart